Tensions are boiling over once again inside Russia's military machine. And this time, it isn't Ukraine pushing Moscow toward the edge. It's Vladimir Putin himself. After years of humiliations, disasters, and strategic withdrawals that fooled nobody, Putin is turning his rage inward. His warlords failed him. His commanders embarrassed him. His navy has been humiliated in full view of the world. And now, the Kremlin is doing what it always does when reality becomes too painful to face. It's looking for someone to blame. Because when an authoritarian regime starts eating its own generals, that's not strength. That's decay. That's panic. That's desperation. And more than anything, it's proof that Russia's war in Ukraine isn't moving toward victory. It's sliding toward collapse. The first head now wobbling under Putin's axe is Vice Admiral Sergei Pinchuk, the commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Correction, was a commander, at least if the reports coming out of Russia's own internal networks are accurate. The news of Pinchuk's likely removal didn't come from the Kremlin, because Moscow doesn't like admitting failure. It came from the pro-Ukrainian partisan group Atesh, which has been increasingly effective at exposing what Russian officials try to hide. In a telegram update, Atesh claimed its agents inside the fleet structures had uncovered something explosive, that Russia's top brass is preparing to replace Pinchuk due to catastrophic defensive failures. And not failure in the way Russia loves to twist the word. Not a tactical setback, not a temporary difficulty. Real failure, the kind that gets ships destroyed, bases hit, officers humiliated, and entire fleets forced to flee the very waters they were built to dominate. Atesh reported that rumors are spreading through officers' circles that Pinchuk's replacement is already being discussed at the highest levels. The reason, they claim, is systemic breakdown. Failures to secure bases, failures to protect ships, failures to counter Ukraine's unmanned naval boats, and the almost laughable lack of effectiveness in Russia's defensive measures. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because this isn't a one-time mistake. This is a pattern. In the last 6 months alone, Atesh claims at least 8 successful Ukrainian attacks using unmanned naval drones have struck Black Sea Fleet facilities, including Sevastopol and other key bases in Crimea. In some cases, they say, it took Russian forces up to 40 minutes to respond. 40 minutes. In modern warfare, 40 minutes is not a delay. It's a death sentence. That's not an army caught off guard. That's a military that has lost control of its own environment, and the consequences are devastating. Ukrainian drone boats don't need to defeat Russia's fleet in a classic naval battle. They just need to keep showing up, keep striking, keep humiliating, and keep forcing Russia's warships to retreat farther and farther away. Because every successful strike doesn't just destroy equipment, it destroys confidence. It destroys the illusion of Russian dominance. And it exposes a truth Putin can't stand. Ukraine is winning in the Black Sea without even having a traditional navy. But here's the part that makes Pinchuk's situation even worse. He's not the first commander to be sacrificed. He's not even the second. Pinchuk is on track to become the third Black Sea Fleet commander to fall during this war. That alone tells you everything you need to know about the scale of the disaster. Because if the Kremlin keeps swapping commanders like broken light bulbs, the problem isn't the commanders. The problem is that the entire fleet has become a liability. When the invasion began, Russia's Black Sea Fleet was supposed to be one of the most intimidating tools in Moscow's arsenal. It could blockade Ukrainian ports, launch cruise missiles, support amphibious landings, control sea lanes, threaten NATO's southeastern flank. Instead, it has become a floating symbol of Russian failure. The collapse started early. Back in April 2022, Ukraine delivered one of the most shocking blows of the war. Neptune anti-ship missiles slammed into the Moskva, the flagship cruiser of the Black Sea Fleet, and sent it to the bottom of the sea. The Moskva wasn't just a ship. It was a statement, a pride symbol, a flagship in every sense of the word. And it died in flames. The man in charge at the time, Igor Osipov, didn't last long afterward. His removal became one of the first major examples of the Kremlin's blame game. When your flagship sinks, someone must pay. When your fleet looks weak, someone must be punished. By August 2022, Osipov was removed. And it wasn't only the Moskva that doomed him. It was a constant chain of Ukrainian strikes, including attacks on the fleet's headquarters in Sevastopol and the growing inability to defend Crimea itself. So Putin brought in a replacement, Viktor Sokolov. And if Osipov's tenure was bad, Sokolov's was catastrophic. Under Sokolov, the Black Sea Fleet didn't recover. It deteriorated. It suffered repeated losses. Ukraine kept striking ships, docks, and infrastructure with a precision that turned Russia's naval presence into a joke. Eventually, the fleet began to withdraw, pulling back from Crimea, relocating, and abandoning positions that Russia once treated as untouchable. The irony was brutal. Russia, the supposed regional naval power, was being chased away by a country that had almost no warships. And then, as if humiliation wasn't enough, Ukraine claimed in September 2023 that it had killed Sokolov and dozens of other officers in a missile strike. Russia denied it, of course, and released strange footage of Sokolov in a video conference. But even that didn't restore confidence, because he never spoke, barely moved, and looked like a man who might not even be alive. Whether Sokolov was killed or not, his career was finished. By February 2024, Russian military bloggers were reporting that he had been fired, and that's when Sergei Pinchuk stepped in. But what exactly did Pinchuk inherit? Not a fleet, a wreck. A fleet already damaged, already retreating, already psychologically broken. A fleet whose sailors knew the truth. Ukraine could hit them anytime, anywhere, and Russia couldn't stop it. By August 2024, the UK Ministry of Defense assessed the Black Sea Fleet as functionally inactive. Ukraine had destroyed roughly a third of it through missile and drone strikes. Russia was forced to pull ships away from occupied Crimea. And the Black Sea, the very body of water that gave the fleet its name, became a place Russia could barely operate without fear. By mid-2025, reports suggested the fleet had almost disappeared from large areas of the western Black Sea. Ukrainian officers openly stated that Russia had stopped attempting landings or close reconnaissance because it knew Ukrainian coastal missiles could strike them. Think about what that means. Russia didn't choose to retreat because it had a clever new strategy. It retreated because it was scared, because it was being hunted, and because it couldn't win. And the fallout from that retreat has been massive. With Russia pushed back, Ukraine regained enough freedom of movement to restart grain shipments, a major lifeline for its economy and a strategic win far beyond the battlefield. It wasn't just about ships. It was about money, survival, momentum, international support. All of that came from Russia losing control of the Black Sea. So if Pinchuk is being removed now, it's because Putin needs a scapegoat to cover up what is in reality irreversible damage. And it may not matter who replaces him, because the Black Sea Fleet has been reduced to something closer to a defensive coastal presence than a fleet capable of projecting power. But as humiliating as this naval collapse is, it's not the most terrifying part of Putin's purge, because ships can be replaced, pride can be repaired. But the next commander on the Kremlin chopping block, he's tied to something far worse. He's tied to the grinding slaughter of Russian soldiers, and the kind of brutality that even Moscow can't ignore forever. And before we get into that, if you're watching this and you want more real military breakdowns like this, the kind that exposes what happened behind propaganda and headlines, make sure you subscribe right now. These purges aren't stopping, and the next moves Putin makes could decide the future of the war. Now, let's talk about the next neck on the Kremlin's chopping block, the man whose strategy has turned Russian troops into disposable fuel for a war Putin can't win. Putin's fury doesn't stop at the sea. In fact, the Black Sea Fleet is almost the easy part, because as humiliating as it is to watch billion-dollar warships get chased away by unmanned drone boats, at least a ship can retreat. At least sailors can pull back. At least a fleet can hide. The Russian soldiers on land don't get that luxury. They don't get to sail away. They don't get to withdraw to Novorossiysk and pretend the problem is solved. They get thrown forward. And when they die, frozen, shredded, burned, or buried under rubble, the Kremlin calls it progress. That's why the next figure being chewed up by Putin's machine is far more important than Vice Admiral Pinchuk. The man at the center of this next collapse is one of the brutal faces of the war, the kind of commander Russia uses when it wants to break something, no matter the cost. A general whose name has been tied to the ugliest phases of the invasion, and whose successes were never measured in territory, but in how many soldiers could be fed into the grinder before the line stopped moving. And now, even he is becoming disposable. Because when the Kremlin begins discarding its most ruthless warlords, it isn't reform, it's desperation. This is what a regime does when it's running out of options. Over the last months, the pattern inside Russia has been unmistakable. High-ranking officers removed, commanders reassigned, deputies suddenly vanishing from the public eye, investigations launched behind closed doors, loyalists promoted not because they're competent, but because they're obedient. It's the classic authoritarian cycle. When the battlefield refuses to deliver victory, the dictator turns inward and tries to force reality to obey. But reality doesn't care about propaganda. Reality is measured in outcomes. And the outcomes for Russia are getting harder to hide. Look at what has happened across the front. The promises of quick breakthroughs turned into stalled offensives. The new strategies became repeated assaults over open ground. The decisive strikes became a routine of wasted artillery and drone footage, showing Russian columns burning before they even reach Ukrainian positions. And all the while, Putin needs to keep the illusion alive, the illusion that Russia is advancing, that Ukraine is collapsing, that the West is tiring, that victory is inevitable. So when the war doesn't match the narrative, Putin does what he always does. He purges, because purges serve two purposes. First, they create scapegoats. They give the public someone to blame, someone to point at, someone to say, the plan was fine, but this man failed us. Second, purges terrify everyone still in power. They remind every remaining commander that loyalty matters more than competence, and that failure, or even the appearance of failure, can mean professional death, sometimes literal death. This isn't speculation. It's history. The Soviet Union did it. Stalin did it. Modern Russia has done it in smaller waves. And now Putin is doing it again, because in his mind, fear is a substitute for strategy. But the deeper truth is this. Putin's commanders are being punished for a war that cannot be won the way he wants it to be won, because the reality on the ground has shifted. Ukraine has adapted. Ukraine has innovated. Ukraine has learned how to bleed Russia without giving Russia the decisive battle it craves. Every time Russia tries to concentrate forces, Ukraine strikes. Every time Russia tries to mass armor, Ukraine hunts it. Every time Russia tries to take a city, Ukraine turns it into a trap. And what does Russia do in response? It doubles down on the one thing it still has plenty of: manpower. Not skilled manpower, not well-trained troops, just manpower, men, bodies. And when your strategy becomes send more men until something breaks, the person responsible for executing that strategy eventually becomes a liability. Not because he failed to kill enough Ukrainians, but because he killed too many Russians to hide. That's what's changing inside Moscow now. The cost has become impossible to cover up. Russian mothers notice when their sons don't come home. Russian villages notice when their young men vanish. Even in a country saturated with propaganda, there is a limit to how much death can be disguised as victory. So Putin needs new faces, new commanders, new solutions. Not because the old ones were uniquely incompetent, but because the old ones are now associated with failure. And failure is contagious. That's why these purges are not random. They're not isolated. They're connected. They're part of a system that is slowly cracking under the weight of its own war. And here's what makes this especially dangerous. As the Kremlin starts purging, it becomes less rational. Because purges don't create better commanders. They create terrified commanders. And terrified commanders don't innovate. They don't adapt. They don't take risks. They tell Putin what he wants to hear. They report progress where there is none. They send troops forward because it's safer to lose soldiers than to lose favor. And that accelerates the collapse. It becomes a loop. Putin demands victory. Commanders fake success. Soldiers die. Reality worsens. Putin rages. Commanders are purged. New commanders fake success. More soldiers die. And the war becomes a machine that only consumes. So when you see Putin turning on his own generals, it's not a sign that Russia is fixing the problem. It's a sign the problem has grown too large to manage. And that's why this moment matters. Because the Black Sea Fleet commander being replaced is not just about naval incompetence. It's a symptom of a wider breakdown in Russian command. A breakdown so severe that even the Kremlin's most brutal land commanders are now being pushed aside, blamed, and discarded like worn-out tools. And the question isn't whether this will weaken Russia. It will. The question is what Putin will do next, because when dictators feel cornered, they don't become cautious. They become reckless. And Putin is running out of conventional options. That's why, even as he purges his commanders, he's also leaning harder on the one thing he believes can still save him. Not the Navy, not competent generals, not strategy, but something darker, something more desperate. Because the next step in Putin's war isn't about improving performance. It's about changing the rules of the game entirely. And what he's relying on next is what truly confirms that Ukraine's war is not the one being lost. It's Russia's. Because once a regime starts purging its own commanders, it's no longer fighting just Ukraine. It's fighting time. It's fighting reality. And most of all, it's fighting itself. The truth is, Putin can fire admirals. He can reshuffle generals. He can drag officers into closed rooms in Moscow and demand answers that don't exist. He can even blame the weather, the West, NATO traitors, or saboteurs. But he cannot purge the battlefield. He cannot purge the drone footage. He cannot purge the simple math of modern war, where a cheap Ukrainian FPV drone can erase $1 million Russian vehicle in seconds, and where every offensive becomes a gamble with lives Russia can no longer afford to waste. And that is exactly why the Kremlin's leadership is crumbling, because the war is exposing something that is almost impossible to hide. Russia's military isn't failing because of one bad commander. It's failing because the entire system is built on lies. A system where promotions are earned through loyalty, not competence. Where generals fear telling the truth more than they fear losing soldiers. Where corruption eats equipment before it ever reaches the front. Where training is rushed, logistics are broken, and units are patched together from whoever can be grabbed, threatened, or paid. And now, after years of grinding warfare, that system is hitting a wall. So Putin is reaching for what authoritarian rulers always reach for when reality turns against them. He's reaching for fear. Not fear aimed at Ukraine. Fear aimed inward. Fear aimed at his own people, his own commanders, his own elite. Because in Putin's mind, fear is power. And if fear is power, then a purge is a weapon. But here's the problem. Purges don't create strength. They create paralysis. When commanders know they'll be punished for failure, they stop thinking like leaders and start thinking like survivors. They don't make the smart decision. They make the safest decision politically. And in war, the politically safe decision is often the militarily catastrophic one. So, what does that look like on the front? It looks like commanders launching assaults they know will fail just to show Moscow they're doing something. It looks like Russian infantry being ordered to storm trenches with no armor support because the armor is too valuable to risk and the men are not. It looks like units being thrown forward again and again, not because the terrain matters, but because reporting no movement is career suicide. It looks like a war machine that no longer cares about winning, only about feeding the illusion that it's not losing. And this is where the war becomes truly dangerous. Because when a state loses the ability to win, it starts looking for ways to avoid admitting defeat. And that's where Putin's next move comes in. Not a move of strength, a move of desperation. A move that confirms the Kremlin is not confident it can outfight Ukraine with conventional means. So instead of fixing what's broken, Putin is relying on something else. Something Russia has leaned on throughout its history when it couldn't win with skill. Mass. Sheer mass. Quantity over quality. And it's happening right now. Because as Russian commanders get purged and replaced, the Kremlin isn't rebuilding its military into something smarter or more modern. It's rebuilding it into something bigger and uglier. You're seeing it in how Russia recruits. Not with patriotism, with coercion, with desperation, with incentives that prey on poverty, with promises made to men who have no idea they're signing their own death warrant. You're seeing it in prisons being emptied into assault units. You're seeing it in mobilization waves disguised as contract service. You're seeing it in foreign manpower, too. Men imported, recruited, pressured, or deceived into fighting for a war that isn't theirs. And you're seeing it in Russia's tactics. Not maneuver warfare, not combined arms, not clever strategy, but human wave grinding, one after another, the same horrific formula. Send men until Ukraine runs out of bullets. That's what Putin is relying on next. And that's why the purges matter so much. Because once the Kremlin starts removing commanders, it's not because it has a better plan. It's because it has no plan. And when there is no plan, the only thing left is brute force. But brute force in modern war comes with a price Russia is paying in blood. And now the Kremlin is facing an impossible dilemma. If it keeps attacking like this, it bleeds itself out. If it stops attacking, it admits it can't win. If it negotiates, Putin looks weak. If it escalates, it risks triggering consequences Russia can't control. So Putin is trying to do what dictators always try to do: force the world to accept his narrative. He's firing commanders to make it look like he's fixing the war. He's promoting loyalists to make it look like the system is stable. He's punishing failures to make it look like accountability exists. But behind the curtain, the reality is much darker. Russia is eating itself alive. And the moment a regime begins cannibalizing its own leadership during a war, it's a warning sign that the foundation is cracking. Because wars don't just destroy armies. They destroy trust. They destroy unity. They destroy legitimacy. And once that begins, the collapse doesn't always happen on the battlefield first. Sometimes it happens in the palace. That's why these purges are so revealing. They show panic. They show blame. They show desperation. And they show something Putin will never admit out loud. He knows this war isn't going the way he promised. He knows the world can see it. And he knows his own commanders are running out of excuses. So now he's doing what he always does when cornered. He's cutting down his own men to protect himself. But here's the most important part. This doesn't make Russia stronger. It makes Russia more fragile, more unstable, more unpredictable. And a fragile, unstable Russia led by a desperate Putin is far more dangerous than a confident one. Because desperate leaders don't seek victory. They seek survival. And survival can justify anything. So as Putin purges admirals, discards generals, and throws more bodies into fire, the real question becomes, what happens when even that isn't enough? What happens when fear stops working? What happens when the war machine finally hits the moment where it cannot be fed anymore? Because if Putin has already started turning on his own commanders, then the next people he'll turn on won't be in uniform. And when that moment comes, Russia's war won't just be in Ukraine anymore. It will be everywhere, including inside Russia itself. And that is when things get truly explosive. If you want me to keep breaking down the real moves behind the Kremlin's decisions and the hidden cracks inside this war that mainstream headlines don't explain, then make sure you hit the like button. It helps this video reach more people who actually want the truth, not propaganda. And subscribe right now, because the next story we're covering is even bigger, and it explains what Putin is quietly preparing in the background while the world watches the front lines. Also, I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Putin's purges mean Russia is collapsing? Or do you think he's getting ready to escalate the war in a way the world isn't ready for? Drop your answer below. I read the comments and I'll pin the strongest one.